The floorboards in our century-old house have always been gossips, creaking out secrets at 3 a.m. when decent people should be asleep. Tonight they whispered about my wife's hushed phone conversation drifting up from the kitchen below. "He speaks directly to God. You wouldn't understand," Margot's voice carried through the heating vents with that particular tone she reserved for explaining why I couldn't grasp the finer points of her spiritual awakening. The same tone she'd used when describing why our marriage needed divine intervention and why she'd started attending those evening counseling sessions at the New Faith Ministry. "I'm Thomas Ashford, and I fix computers for a living. When systems crash, I find the problem and eliminate it. Simple logic, clean solutions. But lately, my wife had become a puzzle I couldn't debug, filled with encrypted behaviors and mysterious processes running in the background. Malachi says the Lord has special plans for me," she continued into the phone, her voice dropping to that breathy whisper she used to reserve for me. "Tomorrow's session will be transformative." Transformative. Right. Maybe God was running a premium subscription service now, complete with private consultations and hands-on guidance. I slipped out of bed, avoiding the particularly chatty board near the dresser, and crept to the top of the stairs. Through the banister spindles, I could see Margot pacing the kitchen in her silk nightgown, the expensive one I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, when I still believed her late-night absences were book club meetings. "I can't talk much longer," she whispered. "Thomas might wake up. You know how he gets about my spiritual growth?" "How I get?" "I get suspicious when my wife starts dressing like she's auditing for a Victoria's catalog while claiming she's pursuing religious enlightenment. I get curious when our joint checking account shows cash withdrawals marked church donations that coincidentally match the cost of lingerie receipts I found tucked behind her jewelry box." The conversation ended with a soft, "Good night, Malachi," that carried more intimacy than our bedroom had seen in months. I heard her footsteps on the stairs and scrambled back to bed, pulling the covers up and forcing my breathing into the steady rhythm of fake sleep. Margot slipped under the sheets beside me, and I caught the scent of expensive perfume. Not the drugstore brand she usually wore, but something that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Another divine revelation, no doubt. "Thomas?" she whispered. "Are you awake?" I kept my breathing steady, playing possum while she settled in beside me. Through slitted eyes, I watched her stare at the ceiling, a small smile playing on her lips. Whatever transformation she was anticipating, it had her glowing with anticipation. The next morning brought the usual domestic theater. Margot hummed while making coffee, wearing a sundress that showed off the gym membership she'd suddenly acquired 3 months ago. Her phone buzzed constantly with text messages that made her smile and type rapid responses. "Another counseling session tonight?" I asked, buttering my toast with deliberate casualness. "Malachi thinks I'm making real progress," she said, not looking up from her phone. "He says I have a special connection to the divine that needs nurturing." Special connection? Sure. I wondered if this divine connection required her to shave her legs every single day now, or if that was just a blessed coincidence. "What kind of progress exactly?" I pressed. She finally looked up, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small mark on her neck, just below her collar. A bruise, maybe, or just a shadow. But it made my stomach clench with a suspicion I didn't want to acknowledge. "You wouldn't understand, Thomas. You've always been closed off to spiritual matters. Malachi says some people are just limited in their capacity for transcendence." Limited. That was a new one. Usually she just called me practical or logical, but apparently my spiritual credit rating had been downgraded to limited. Maybe I should ask Malachi for a divine loan to upgrade my transcendence package. "Right," I said. "Well, enjoy your transcendence. I'll be here, limited as usual." She kissed my forehead like I was a child who couldn't understand adult conversations, grabbed her purse, and headed for the door. "I'll be late tonight. Malachi scheduled an extended session." Extended session. The words hung in the air after she left, and I found myself staring at the coffee cup she'd abandoned, lipstick staining the rim in a perfect crescent. Everything about her had become perfect lately. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect excuses for why she needed so much spiritual guidance. I called in late to work, claiming a family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. My marriage was definitely experiencing some kind of system failure, and I needed time to run diagnostics. First stop, the New Faith Ministry. The building sat on the edge of downtown, a converted warehouse that someone had dressed up with a cross and a sign promising personal relationship with the divine. The parking lot was mostly empty at 10 in the morning, but I recognized Margot's Honda parked near the back entrance. Interesting. Her office job didn't start until 9, and she'd left the house at 8:30. Either she'd developed a sudden passion for early morning prayer, or there was more to these sessions than spiritual guidance. I parked across the street and waited. 20 minutes later, Margot emerged from the building, checking her appearance in her phone's camera before getting into her car. She looked satisfied, like someone who'd just received excellent customer service. A few minutes after she left, a man stepped out of the same back entrance. Mid-40s, silver hair, expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He moved with the confident swagger of someone who believed his own publicity, checking his watch and adjusting his tie like he was preparing for a photo shoot. This had to be Malachi Stern, the man who spoke directly to God and apparently had a lot to discuss with my wife. I followed him at a distance as he walked to a sleek BMW parked in the reserved spot closest to the building. The license plate read Blessed One, subtle as a brick through a stained glass window. He drove to an upscale apartment complex on the north side of town, the kind of place that charged extra for the privilege of living above your means. So God's messenger lived in luxury while preaching about spiritual fulfillment. Somehow, I wasn't surprised. My phone buzzed with a text from Margot. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." Working late. Right. I was starting to understand what kind of work she was doing. I spent the rest of the day doing what I do best, gathering information. A few discreet online searches revealed that Malachi Stern had founded the New Faith Ministry 2 years ago, after moving here from California. His website promised personal spiritual guidance and direct communion with divine will. The photos showed him surrounded by adoring followers, mostly women, all gazing at him like he was broadcasting directly from heaven. The testimonials were particularly interesting. "Malachi helped me discover my true spiritual nature," wrote Jennifer M. "He showed me that God had special plans for my life," gushed Patricia R. "My private sessions with Malachi transformed my understanding of divine love," testified Rebecca L. Divine Love. Personal guidance. Private sessions. Either this guy was running the most successful prayer service in the Midwest, or he'd found a creative way to package adultery as a religious experience. That evening, I drove past the New Faith Ministry again. The parking lot was fuller now, with about a dozen cars scattered around the building. I recognized several vehicles from our neighborhood, including the silver sedan belonging to David Waverly, whose wife Linda had recently discovered her own spiritual calling. David worked at the auto shop downtown, a straight-talking guy who'd always struck me as having both feet firmly planted on the ground. If his wife was also receiving divine guidance from Malachi, maybe I wasn't the only husband feeling left out of the spiritual loop. I parked and walked to the building's main entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see into what had once been the warehouse's main floor. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, motivational posters on the walls, and a small stage at the front where Malachi stood addressing his flock. "God speaks to each of us differently," his voice carried through the glass. "Some receive his message through prayer, others through meditation, but for those truly chosen, he speaks directly, intimately, personally." The audience nodded like synchronized swimmers, hanging on every word. I spotted Margot in the front row, leaning forward with rapt attention. She'd changed clothes since this morning, trading her work attire for a flowing skirt and low-cut blouse that seemed more appropriate for a date than a prayer meeting. "Tonight, I'll be conducting private consultations for those ready to receive God's personal message," Malachi continued. "These sessions require complete openness, complete trust, complete surrender to divine will." Complete surrender. I bet they did. The meeting broke up around 9 o'clock, with people filing out in small groups, chattering excitedly about spiritual breakthroughs and divine revelations. I ducked behind a parked car as Margot walked past, but she wasn't heading for her Honda. Instead, she disappeared around the back of the building, toward the entrance I'd seen her use that morning. I waited another hour, watching the parking lot empty until only a few cars remained, including Margot's Honda and Malachi's blessed BMW. The building went dark except for a single window on the second floor, where warm light suggested someone was still conducting business. Divine business, apparently. I drove home and poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey, sitting in my kitchen and staring at the receipts I'd found hidden in Margot's jewelry box. Lingerie, perfume, a hotel room charged to her credit card last Tuesday. The same Tuesday she'd claimed to be attending a women's prayer circle. Either God had very specific requirements for worship attire, or my wife was exploring a different kind of religious experience altogether. The front door opened at midnight, and Margot slipped in quietly, assuming I'd be asleep. I heard her pause in the hallway, probably checking her appearance in the mirror, before climbing the stairs with careful, silent steps. She slid into bed beside me, and I caught that expensive perfume again, mixed now with something else, a masculine cologne that definitely didn't come from any divine source I recognized. "Thomas?" she whispered. "Are you awake?" I kept my breathing steady, but inside, my mind was racing through possibilities and connections, debugging the system failure that my marriage had become. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd start looking for other husbands who might be experiencing similar spiritual difficulties. Because if God was really speaking directly to Malachi Stern, he seemed to have a very specific message about married women and private consultations, and I had a feeling I wasn't the only husband who'd been left out of the conversation. Waverly's auto shop occupied a corner lot downtown, the kind of place where honest work still meant something and men fixed problems with their hands instead of hiding behind corporate doublespeak. I found David Waverly under the hood of a Ford pickup, his weathered face concentrated on an engine that had seen better decades. "Thomas Ashford," I said, approaching cautiously. "We live a few streets apart. I think our wives attend the same spiritual meetings." David straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had absorbed more grease than a fast food fryer. His eyes held the same tired wariness I'd been seeing in my own mirror lately. "New Faith Ministry," he said, not making it a question. "Yeah, Linda's found religion real sudden-like. It used to be she couldn't be bothered with Sunday service. Now she's there 3 nights a week, getting personally guided by God's chosen messenger." The way he said personally guided suggested we were thinking along the same lines. "Your wife mention anything about private consultations?" I asked. "Private consultations, extended sessions, spiritual breakthroughs?" David tossed the rag onto his workbench with more force than necessary. "Funny thing about these breakthroughs. They all seem to happen after regular hours, and they leave her glowing like she just won the lottery." I leaned against the workbench, feeling the relief of finding someone who understood the situation without needing a detailed explanation. Margot's been attending these sessions for 3 months now. Suddenly she needs expensive perfume to commune with the divine. "Linda bought lingerie last week," David said flatly. "When I asked about it, she said God wanted her to feel beautiful in his presence. Apparently the Lord has very specific taste in undergarments." We stood there for a moment, 2 men acknowledging what neither wanted to say directly. The elephant in the room was wearing a clerical collar and driving a BMW with vanity plates. "You know Eric Brennan?" David asked. "Lives over on Maple Street, works at the insurance office with your wife?" I nodded. Eric was a quiet guy, kept to himself mostly, but I'd seen him at neighborhood barbecues before his wife discovered her spiritual calling. His wife started attending New Faith about 6 weeks ago. Same pattern, late nights, new clothes, sudden interest in personal grooming. Yesterday I saw him at the hardware store buying a bottle of whiskey at 10 in the morning. Rough morning? Or rough marriage. Point is, I don't think we're the only husbands feeling left out of our wives' spiritual journeys. David grabbed 2 sodas from a mini fridge and handed me one. The cold bottle felt good in my palm, something real and solid in a world that had started feeling like smoke and mirrors. "So, what do we do about it?" I asked. "Well," David said, taking a long pull from his soda, "I've been thinking about that. See, Linda's been real secretive about her phone lately. Changed her passcode, takes it with her to the bathroom, sleeps with it under her pillow, but yesterday she forgot to lock it when she was in the shower. And Malachi Stern sends a lot of text messages for a man of God. Real, personal messages about how the Lord has chosen her for special blessings, how their private time together is sacred, how she shouldn't discuss their sessions with anyone who might not understand the divine nature of their relationship." I felt my jaw clench. Margot's been getting similar messages. I saw one pop up on her screen yesterday before she could hide it, something about preparing herself for tonight's revelation. "Here's the thing, though," David continued. "These messages, they're not just going to Linda. I recognized a few phone numbers, other women from the neighborhood who've suddenly found religion. Looks like God's messenger is spreading his divine attention pretty thin." That was interesting. If Malachi was sending identical messages to multiple women, it suggested a pattern rather than genuine spiritual guidance, more like a predator with a systematic approach. "You think the other husbands know?" "I think the other husbands are doing what we were doing, drinking alone and pretending everything's fine while their wives get personally blessed by God's representative on earth." David finished his soda and crushed the can with one hand. "But here's what I'm thinking. If we're all dealing with the same problem, maybe we should deal with it together. Pool our resources, share information, figure out exactly what kind of divine intervention our wives are receiving." It made sense. Individual husbands could be dismissed as jealous or spiritually limited, but a group of husbands with documented evidence? That would be harder to explain away. "You have anyone else in mind?" "Eric Brennan, like I mentioned. Ben Torres from over on Oak Street. His wife Maria started attending New Faith last month. And Caleb Wright, whose wife Sarah has been going to private counseling sessions twice a week. 5 husbands, 5 wives, all receiving personal attention from the same spiritual leader. Either we were witnessing the greatest religious awakening in the city's history, or Malachi Stern was running the most audacious scam I'd ever encountered. "Where do you want to meet?" "The Lamplighter," David said. "Back booth, tomorrow night at 8. It's dark enough for privacy and loud enough that we won't be overheard." The Lamplighter was a working man's bar, the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions. Perfect for a gathering of husbands planning to investigate their wives' spiritual advisor. "What should we bring?" "Evidence," David said grimly. "Phone records, credit card statements, receipts, photos, anything that documents the pattern. If we're going to confront this situation, we need to be armed with facts." I spent the rest of the day gathering ammunition. Margot's credit card statements revealed a pattern of charges that painted an interesting picture of her spiritual journey. Hotel rooms on days when she claimed to be attending prayer circles. Expensive restaurants during lunch hours when she was supposedly at work. Lingerie purchases that coincided with her private consultation schedule. The phone records were even more revealing. Dozens of calls to and from Malachi's number, often lasting an hour or more. Text messages sent at all hours, including several exchanges that happened while she was supposedly asleep beside me. I also did some deeper digging into Malachi Stern's background. His real name, it turned out, was Michael Stevens, and he'd left California under circumstances that suggested his previous ministry had encountered some difficulties with local authorities. Nothing criminal on record, but enough complaints and civil suits to suggest a pattern of behavior that extended beyond our small city. The next evening, I arrived at the Lamplighter 15 minutes early and claimed the back booth David had suggested. The bar was dimly lit and filled with the comfortable noise of working people unwinding after long days. Perfect cover for our meeting. David arrived first, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. Eric Brennan came next, looking like a man who hadn't slept well in weeks. Ben Torres followed, his usual easy smile replaced by grim determination. Caleb Wright brought up the rear, clutching a beer like a lifeline. We sat around the table like conspirators, which I suppose we were. 5 husbands united by a common problem, ready to compare notes and plan our response. "Gentlemen," David said, raising his beer in a mock toast, "welcome to the Spiritually Limited Husbands Club. Let's see what we've learned about our wives' divine experiences." The evidence was overwhelming. 5 women, all following identical patterns of behavior: new clothes, expensive perfumes, secretive phone calls, and regular private sessions with Malachi Stern. Credit card records showed hotel charges, restaurant meals, and purchases that suggested these spiritual consultations involved more than prayer and meditation. "Look at this," Eric said, sliding a photograph across the table. "I followed Rebecca to her consultation last Tuesday. This is them leaving the hotel where she claimed to be attending a women's retreat." The photo showed Rebecca and Malachi walking out of the Riverside Inn, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that seemed more intimate than pastoral. "I got similar photos," Ben added. "Maria told me she was going to evening prayer service, but I found her car parked at Malachi's apartment complex." We spread the evidence across the table like detectives working a case. Phone records, photographs, receipts, and testimonies that painted a clear picture of systematic deception. Malachi Stern wasn't just conducting private spiritual sessions. He was running a harem disguised as a religious ministry. "So, what's our next move?" Caleb asked. "We expose him," David said simply. "Sunday morning, during regular service, in front of his entire congregation. Let them see what kind of divine guidance their spiritual leader has been providing." "How?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Leave that to me. I know a thing or two about audio-visual equipment, and the New Faith Ministry has a very nice projection system for their inspirational presentations." "You're talking about hacking their church service?" "I'm talking about providing the congregation with some additional spiritual education. Let them see the text messages their leader has been sending. Show them the photographs of his private consultations. Give them a chance to witness his divine methodology firsthand." The plan was simple but effective. We'd infiltrate Sunday morning service, take control of their presentation system, and broadcast the evidence we'd collected. Let Malachi explain to his followers why God's personal messages looked suspiciously like pickup lines, and why his spiritual guidance required hotel rooms and expensive lingerie. "What about our wives?" Eric asked. "What about them?" David replied. "They made their choices. Now they get to live with the consequences." We spent another hour refining the details, coordinating our approach, and preparing for what would either be the most satisfying morning of our lives or a complete disaster. But sitting there with 4 other men who understood exactly what I'd been going through, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Malachi Stern thought he was untouchable, protected by religious authority and his followers' blind faith. He'd counted on our silence, our embarrassment, our willingness to suffer in private rather than expose our wives' infidelity. He'd miscalculated. Sunday morning was going to be very educational for everyone involved. The New Faith Ministries website provided helpful information about their Sunday services, including a detailed floor plan of the converted warehouse and specifications for their audio-visual system. Apparently, Malachi believed in transparency when it came to everything except his private counseling methods. I spent Friday evening studying the building's layout and researching their equipment. The projection system was a standard commercial setup, controlled by a laptop connected to the main display screen. Simple enough to access if you knew what you were doing, and I'd been troubleshooting similar systems for 15 years. Saturday morning brought an unexpected opportunity. Margot announced she'd be spending the day at a women's spiritual retreat, giving me free access to our home and her personal belongings. I used the time productively, copying her text message history and documenting the evidence I'd need for tomorrow's presentation. The messages were even more explicit than I'd expected. Malachi's text read like a combination of religious instruction and dating app conversations, mixing biblical references with suggestions that would make a romance novelist blush. My wife's responses showed enthusiasm that she hadn't demonstrated for our marriage in years. "God has chosen you for special blessings," read one message from Malachi. "Tonight's session will reveal the depth of divine love available to those who surrender completely." Margot's reply: "I'm ready to receive whatever the Lord wants to give me. I've prepared myself as you instructed." Divine love? Right. I wondered if God was charging by the hour for these special blessings. I compiled the most damaging exchanges into a presentation file, complete with screenshots and timestamps. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic seduction disguised as spiritual guidance. Tomorrow's congregation would get an education they weren't expecting. Saturday evening, I met with the other husbands at David's auto shop to finalize our plan. We divided responsibilities based on our individual skills and knowledge of the building layout. "I'll handle the technical aspects," I explained. "David and Ben will create distractions if anyone tries to interfere with the presentation. Eric and Caleb will document everything with their phones in case we need evidence later." "What about security?" Eric asked. "What if they try to stop us?" "It's a church service, not a military operation," David said. "Worst case scenario, they ask us to leave, but by then, the damage will be done. Once that congregation sees what their spiritual leader has really been doing, Malachi's credibility will be finished." We reviewed the evidence one more time, making sure our presentation told a complete story. Phone records showing the pattern of communication, credit card statements documenting hotel visits and expensive purchases, photographs of Malachi with various congregation members in compromising situations, and most damning of all, the text messages that revealed his true methodology. "This feels like overkill," Caleb said, looking through the thick folder of documentation. "Any one of these pieces of evidence would be enough to destroy him." "We're not just destroying him," I replied. "We're making sure he can never do this again, anywhere else. When we're finished, Malachi Stern will be radioactive in any community that does an internet search on his name." Sunday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made people want to attend church services. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would help me blend in with the regular congregation. Just another faithful husband supporting his wife's spiritual journey. Margot spent extra time on her appearance, selecting an outfit that managed to be both modest and alluring, a skill she'd apparently developed during her months of divine education. She hummed while applying makeup, clearly anticipating another transformative experience. "You should come with me today," she said, adjusting her necklace in the mirror. "Malachi's sermons are really inspiring. He might help you understand what you've been missing." What I'd been missing. That was rich. Apparently, I'd been missing the opportunity to watch my wife receive personal attention from a charlatan in expensive suits. "Maybe next time," I said. "I've got some projects to work on around the house." Projects like destroying her spiritual advisor's reputation and exposing his methodology to public scrutiny. But she didn't need those details. "Your loss," she said, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of someone who'd already moved on emotionally. "Malachi says closed minds can't receive divine blessings." Closed minds? Right. Apparently my mind was too closed to appreciate the divine blessing of sharing my wife with a religious con artist. After she left, I loaded my laptop bag with the equipment I'd need for the morning's presentation: USB drives, connection cables, and backup files in case something went wrong with the primary plan. I'd learned long ago that successful system interventions required redundancy and preparation. The New Faith Ministries parking lot was nearly full when I arrived, with families streaming toward the main entrance in their Sunday best. I recognized several faces from the neighborhood, people I'd known for years who'd apparently found spiritual fulfillment in Malachi's teachings. David was waiting near the entrance, looking uncomfortable in a tie and dress shirt. "Ready for this?" he asked. "More than ready. You see the others?" Ben's already inside, sitting near the back. Eric and Caleb are coming in separately, spreading out through the congregation. If this goes sideways, we'll have witnesses positioned throughout the room. We entered the building together, joining the flow of people moving toward the main worship area. The converted warehouse had been transformed into something resembling a traditional church, with rows of folding chairs facing a raised platform where Malachi would deliver his sermon. I spotted Margot in the third row, sitting with Linda Waverly and several other wives who'd discovered their spiritual callings. They chatted quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the platform with anticipation. The audio-visual booth was located at the back of the room, elevated slightly to provide clear sightlines to the projection screen. Perfect for my purposes, and isolated enough that I could work without immediate interference. "Good morning, faithful servants," Malachi's voice boomed through the sound system as he took the stage. He looked every inch the successful spiritual leader, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than most of his followers made in a month. "Today we'll be discussing the nature of divine love," he continued, "and how God calls certain individuals to receive his blessings in special, personal ways. Divine love. Personal blessings." The man had no shame whatsoever. I made my way to the back of the room, slipping into the audio-visual booth while Malachi launched into his opening prayer. The equipment was exactly as I'd expected. A standard laptop connected to the projection system, currently displaying inspirational quotes and biblical verses. The technical aspects were straightforward. I connected my USB drive to the laptop, uploaded my presentation files, and prepared to interrupt Malachi's sermon with some supplementary educational material. "God speaks to each of us differently," Malachi was saying, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who delivered this speech many times before. "But for those truly chosen, he provides direct, intimate guidance through his appointed representatives." Intimate guidance. That was my cue. I activated my presentation, and the projection screen flickered from biblical quotes to something much more revealing. The first slide showed a compilation of text messages between Malachi and various congregation members, with names redacted but content clearly visible. "Tonight's session will awaken desires you never knew existed," read one message. "God wants you to experience pleasure beyond your earthly marriage." The congregation's reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps, murmurs, and confused whispers rippled through the room as people tried to process what they were seeing. Malachi stopped mid-sentence, turning to look at the screen behind him. His face went through several interesting color changes as he realized what was being displayed. "There seems to be a technical malfunction," he said, his voice losing its confident authority. "If someone could please—" But I was just getting started. The next slide showed photographs of Malachi with congregation members at various hotels and restaurants, clearly engaged in activities that had nothing to do with spiritual guidance. The timestamps corresponded to dates when these women had supposedly been attending prayer meetings or religious retreats. "This is not appropriate," Malachi said, his voice rising with panic. "Someone needs to stop this immediately." David stood up from his seat near the middle of the room. "Actually, I think this is very appropriate. The congregation deserves to know what kind of spiritual guidance they've been receiving." More slides followed, each one more damaging than the last. Credit card records showing hotel charges, phone logs documenting late-night conversations, and most devastating of all, a compilation of identical text messages sent to multiple women, revealing the systematic nature of Malachi's approach. "Each of you is special," read the messages. "God has chosen you for unique blessings that require privacy and discretion. Your husband wouldn't understand the divine nature of our relationship." The congregation was in full uproar now, with people standing, shouting questions, and demanding explanations. Several women were crying, including my wife, who sat frozen in her chair as the reality of her situation became public knowledge. "These are fabrications," Malachi shouted over the noise. "Someone is trying to destroy God's work with lies and deception." But the evidence was overwhelming, and his denials sounded hollow in the face of documented proof. I advanced to the final slide, which showed a simple timeline of his activities over the past 6 months. Hotel visits, private meetings, and cash payments that painted a clear picture of his true methodology. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, standing up in the audio-visual booth so everyone could see me. "Meet your spiritual leader's real divine guidance program. As you can see, God apparently has very specific requirements for private consultations." Security, 2 volunteers from the congregation, started moving toward my position, but David and Ben intercepted them with polite but firm requests to let the presentation continue. "The truth needs to come out," David said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Our wives deserve better than this, and so does this community." Malachi made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "Brothers and sisters, don't let jealous husbands poison your faith with their lies and suspicions." But it was too late. The evidence spoke for itself, and his congregation was already fragmenting. Some people stormed out in disgust, others surrounded the women who'd been receiving private guidance, and a few approached the platform demanding direct answers from their spiritual leader. "Is this true, Malachi?" called out an elderly woman from the front row. "Have you been taking advantage of these women?" "God works in mysterious ways," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sometimes divine love requires—" "Divine love requires hotel rooms?" interrupted another congregation member. "It requires expensive lingerie and secret phone calls?" The questions came faster now, with people demanding explanations that Malachi couldn't provide. His carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time, destroyed by the weight of documented evidence. I packed up my equipment and prepared to leave, satisfied that the morning's work was complete. The new faith ministry would not survive this revelation, and Malachi Stern's career as a spiritual leader was effectively over. As I walked toward the exit, I passed my wife, who sat slumped in her chair with tears streaming down her face. She looked up at me with a mixture of shame and anger. "How could you do this?" she whispered. "How could I do this?" I replied quietly. "The question is how you could do what you did, but I guess we both have our answers now." Outside in the parking lot, the other husbands were waiting by their cars, looking like men who'd just won a difficult battle. The congregation was still streaming out of the building, some in angry groups, others in stunned silence. "Think that did the job?" Eric asked. "Oh, that definitely did the job," I said, watching Malachi emerge from the building, surrounded by angry former followers. His divine guidance program just got permanently canceled. The man who spoke directly to God was about to discover what it felt like when an entire community stopped listening. The fallout from Sunday's revelation spread through our community like wildfire in dry grass. By Monday morning, everyone in town knew about Malachi Stern's creative interpretation of spiritual guidance, and the new faith ministry had effectively ceased to exist. I spent Monday at work fielding phone calls from neighbors who'd heard about the church service and wanted details. Word travels fast in a small city, especially when it involves religious scandal and marital drama. By lunchtime, 3 different people had asked if I was the computer guy who exposed that fake preacher. Fame, apparently, came in many forms. Margot hadn't come home Sunday night, and her car was gone when I returned from work Monday evening. I found a note on the kitchen table, written in her careful handwriting. "Staying at my sister's until we can figure this out. We need to talk, but not yet." Not yet. Right. She needed time to craft a narrative that would minimize her responsibility and maximize my role as the villain who destroyed her spiritual awakening. I'd heard this story before, just with different details. Tuesday brought more interesting developments. David called to report that Linda had also disappeared, leaving behind only a hastily packed suitcase and a credit card bill that included charges for a hotel room in the next county. "Think they're together?" I asked. "Linda, Margot, and probably the other wives," David said. "My guess is they're coordinating their stories, trying to figure out how to spin this whole thing as our fault. Let them coordinate. The evidence speaks for itself." Speaking of evidence, you might want to check the local news website. Channel 7 picked up the story. The news article was brief but devastating. Local ministry leader accused of exploiting female followers. It included quotes from several congregation members who'd witnessed Sunday's presentation, along with a statement from the hotel where many of the private consultations had taken place. Most interesting was the final paragraph. Attempts to reach Malachi Stern for comment were unsuccessful. Sources indicate he left town Monday morning, leaving behind unpaid rent and several outstanding debts. So God's messenger had decided to spread his divine guidance to a new community. Probably wise, considering the reception he'd likely receive if he stayed in town much longer. Wednesday evening brought an unexpected visitor. I was grading through takeout Chinese food when the doorbell rang, revealing Eric Brennan standing on my front porch with a bottle of whiskey and a grim expression. "Rebecca came back," he said without preamble. "We need to talk." I invited him in, and we settled in my living room with glasses of his whiskey. Eric looked like a man who'd been through a meat grinder, all hollow eyes and tight jaw muscles. "She wants to work things out," he continued. "Says the whole thing was a mistake, that Malachi manipulated her, that she never meant for it to go so far. And I don't believe her. The text messages, the hotel receipts, the lies, That wasn't manipulation, that was choice. She chose to sneak around, chose to lie to my face, chose to spend our money on her affair with a con artist in a clerical collar. I nodded, understanding his position completely. What did you tell her? I told her she could stay at her mother's while I figured out what comes next. But here's the thing. She's not just apologizing. She's angry. Says we humiliated her in front of the entire community, destroyed her reputation, made it impossible for her to show her face in town. Her reputation, I repeated. Right, because attending private counseling sessions in hotel rooms was doing wonders for her reputation. That's what I said, but according to Rebecca, we're the villains here. We're the ones who couldn't trust our wives, couldn't appreciate their spiritual growth, couldn't understand the special nature of their relationship with Malachi. It was exactly the response I'd expected. When people get caught doing something indefensible, they often try to reframe the situation so that their exposure becomes the real crime. Margot would probably use the same approach when she finally decided to come home. You planning to take her back? I asked. Eric stared into his whiskey glass like it might contain answers to life's more complicated questions. Part of me wants to. 15 years of marriage, 2 kids, a house we bought together. It's hard to throw all that away. But every time I close my eyes, I see those text messages. Every time she touches me, I'll be wondering if she's thinking about him. Every time she's late from work or goes out with friends, I'll be checking her phone and following her car. That's not much of a marriage. No, it's not. And she doesn't seem to understand that. She keeps talking about forgiveness and moving forward, like this was some minor mistake instead of months of systematic deception. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 men processing the wreckage of their marriages and trying to figure out what came next. The whiskey was good, better than anything I usually kept in the house, and it helped dull the sharp edges of anger and betrayal. David's filing for divorce, Eric said eventually. Ben and Caleb are talking to lawyers too. Looks like Malachi's spiritual guidance program is going to generate a lot of business for the legal profession. What about their wives? Same as Rebecca, apologetic but angry, sorry but not really sorry, ready to move forward but not willing to accept responsibility. It's like they all attended the same workshop on how to handle getting caught cheating. Maybe they had. Margot's sister was a therapist who specialized in marriage counseling, and she'd never liked me much. I wouldn't be surprised if she was coaching the wives on damage control strategies. Thursday brought a phone call from Margot herself, the first direct communication since her note on Monday. We need to talk, she said without preamble. I'm coming by the house tonight. Fine. What time? 7 o'clock. And Thomas? I hope you're ready to have an adult conversation about what you've done. What I'd done? Already framing the narrative, just as Eric had predicted. She arrived precisely at 7, dressed in conservative clothes that suggested she'd thought carefully about the image she wanted to project. Repentant wife, perhaps, or wounded victim. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals during our marriage. I want you to know that I forgive you, she began, which was not the opening I'd expected. You forgive me? For humiliating me in front of the entire community, for destroying something beautiful and spiritual because you couldn't understand it, for letting your jealousy and insecurity poison what could have been a healing experience for our marriage. I stared at her, genuinely impressed by the audacity of her approach. According to Margot's version of events, her months-long affair with a religious charlatan had somehow been beneficial for our relationship, and my exposure of the situation was the real betrayal. Tell me about the healing experience, I said. Specifically, tell me about the hotel rooms and the lingerie purchases. Malachi helped me rediscover parts of myself that I'd lost, she replied, not directly answering the question. He showed me that I was worthy of attention, worthy of desire, worthy of being pursued and appreciated. And you couldn't rediscover those parts of yourself without lying to your husband and sneaking around town? You wouldn't have understood. You never understood my need for spiritual connection, for something deeper than your practical, logical approach to everything. Right. So you found something deeper with a con artist who sent identical text messages to half the women in his congregation? That hit home. Her composure cracked slightly, and I saw a flash of the anger Eric had described. Those messages were taken out of context, she said. Malachi was trying to help all of us feel special, feel chosen. The fact that he used similar language doesn't diminish the genuine nature of his guidance. Similar language, I repeated. Margot, he sent the exact same pickup lines to every woman he was sleeping with. Word for word, identical messages. That's not spiritual guidance. That's a copy and paste seduction strategy. You're being deliberately crude about something that was beautiful and meaningful. I'm being accurate about something that was systematic and predatory. We argued in circles for another hour. with Margot insisting that her affair had been a spiritual journey, and me pointing out that spiritual journeys didn't usually require hotel receipts and secret phone calls. She wanted forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without consequences, a return to our marriage without acknowledging what she'd done to destroy it. "So what happens now?" I asked finally. "That depends on you," she said. "Are you willing to work on our marriage, or are you going to let your pride destroy everything we've built together?" Our marriage was destroyed the first time you met Malachi for a private consultation. Everything since then has just been cleanup. That's not true. What we had was real, Thomas. It's still real. We can get past this if you're willing to forgive and move forward. Move forward to what? A marriage where I pretend the last 6 months never happened? Where I smile and nod while you tell me about your spiritual growth? Where I trust you to attend book club meetings and women's retreats? Move forward to a stronger relationship, built on better communication and mutual understanding. Understanding, I said. Right. Help me understand this. When you were in those hotel rooms with Malachi, receiving your spiritual guidance, what exactly were you thinking about our marriage? She didn't answer immediately, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to know. "I think you should go," I said. "Thomas, I think you should go back to your sister's house and figure out what you really want, because if what you want is a husband who'll pretend this never happened, you're going to need to find someone else." She left without another word, and I poured myself another glass of Eric's whiskey. Outside, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had a week ago, but everything had changed. The new faith ministry was gone, Malachi Stern was probably setting up shop in some other unsuspecting community, and 5 marriages were in various stages of collapse. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe clearly. The truth, it turned out, really could set you free. Friday morning brought news that Malachi Stern's troubles extended beyond our small community. David called with an update from his lawyer, who'd been researching our departed spiritual leader's background for potential civil litigation. Turns out, Michael Stevens, that's his real name, has been running variations of this scam for years, David reported. California, Nevada, Arizona. Same pattern every time. Establish a ministry, target married women, provide private spiritual guidance until the husbands catch on, then disappear to the next town. Any criminal charges? Nothing that stuck. He's careful to keep everything technically legal. No fraud, no theft, just adultery disguised as religious counseling. But there's a trail of civil suits and restraining orders stretching back a decade. So he's a professional? Professional predator with a theology degree and a good lawyer. But here's the interesting part. He usually operates alone. This time, he left behind more evidence than usual, probably because he thought our wives would keep quiet indefinitely. That was his mistake. He'd underestimated the husband's willingness to investigate and the wives' inability to maintain operational security. Love affairs require discretion. Religious affairs apparently make people careless. What's your lawyer think about our chances? Depends what we're trying to accomplish. Criminal charges would be difficult, but civil suits for emotional distress and alienation of affection might have merit. Plus, we've got him on breach of contract. He took money for spiritual services and provided something entirely different. Breach of contract. I liked that approach. It reduced the whole situation to simple business terms: services promised, services delivered, customer satisfaction. Malachi had advertised spiritual guidance and delivered seduction. That was basic false advertising. "Count me in," I said. "Even if we don't win, we'll create a legal record that follows him to his next community." Saturday brought an unexpected development. I was working in my garage when a silver BMW pulled into my driveway. Not Malachi's car, but the same model, driven by a woman I didn't recognize. She was probably 45, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested professional success. She approached my garage with purpose, like someone accustomed to getting answers. "Thomas Ashford?" she asked. "Depends who's asking." Janet Morrison, investigative reporter with Channel 12 News. "I'm working on a story about religious fraud and heard you might have some interesting information." Religious fraud. That was a much more serious charge than adultery, and it suggested that our Sunday morning presentation had attracted attention beyond our local community. What kind of story? The kind that exposes predators who use religious authority to exploit vulnerable people. I understand you and several other husbands recently documented some concerning behavior by a local ministry leader. I invited her into the garage and spent the next hour sharing our evidence and explaining our investigation. Janet Morrison was a professional, asking sharp questions and taking detailed notes. She was particularly interested in the systematic nature of Malachi's approach and the identical messages he'd sent to multiple women. "This fits a pattern we've been tracking," she said. predators who use religious or therapeutic authority to manipulate victims. Your documentation is some of the best evidence I've seen. What happens next? We broadcast the story with your permission. We protect the victims' identities but expose the perpetrators' methods. And we make sure that when Michael Stevens tries to set up shop somewhere else, a simple internet search will reveal his history. That evening, I called the other husbands to discuss Janet Morrison's proposal. Everyone agreed that media exposure would provide the best protection for future victims, even if it meant continued embarrassment for our families. Let him try to explain this on the evening news, David said grimly. See how his divine guidance program holds up under professional scrutiny. The news story aired Tuesday night during prime time, with the dramatic title, Wolves in Shepherd's Clothing, How Religious Predators Exploit Faith. Janet Morrison had done her homework, connecting our case to similar incidents in other states and interviewing experts on religious fraud. The segment included excerpts from Malachi's text messages, photographs of his luxury lifestyle, and interviews with congregation members who'd witnessed Sunday's revelation. Most powerful was a brief statement from one of the wives, not mine, who'd agreed to speak anonymously about her experience. He made me feel special, chosen, she said, her voice disguised electronically. He said God had plans for me that my husband wouldn't understand. It wasn't until I saw those identical messages to other women that I realized how manipulated I'd been. The story concluded with a warning about religious predators and resources for victims of spiritual abuse. Janet Morrison's closing statement was particularly effective. Faith should bring people together, not tear families apart. When religious leaders exploit that faith for personal gain, entire communities suffer the consequences. Wednesday morning brought the consequences Janet had mentioned. My phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and people who'd had similar experiences with religious fraud. Margot's sister called to scream at me about destroying her family's reputation. Several neighbors stopped by to express support or ask for details. Most interesting was a call from Detective Ray Oates, who'd been assigned to investigate potential criminal charges against Malachi. We can't prosecute adultery, he explained, but we're looking at possible fraud charges related to the money he collected for religious services. Your documentation might be helpful in establishing a pattern of deceptive practices. I agreed to cooperate with the investigation, though I suspected Malachi was long gone by now. Men like him didn't stick around once their methods became public knowledge. Thursday evening brought my final conversation with Margot. She appeared at my door without warning, looking haggard and angry. The whole country knows now, she said. My mother saw the news story. My coworkers have been asking questions. You've destroyed my life. I exposed a fraud who was exploiting you and other women. If that destroyed your life, maybe you should examine the choices that made you vulnerable to exploitation. Don't lecture me about choices. You chose to humiliate me publicly instead of handling this privately like adults. Adults don't sneak around having affairs with religious charlatans. Adults don't lie to their spouses for months while spending family money on hotel rooms and lingerie. Adults also don't destroy their wives' reputations for revenge. This wasn't revenge, Margot. This was justice. There's a difference, though I understand why you might not recognize it. We stood facing each other across the threshold of what had once been our shared home. Two people who'd become strangers despite years of marriage. She looked older somehow, worn down by the consequences of choices she still didn't seem to fully understand. I want half of everything, she said finally. The house, the savings, the retirement accounts. I'm entitled to my share. You're entitled to what the law says you're entitled to, minus what you spent on your spiritual journey. I've documented every hotel charge, every restaurant meal, every lingerie purchase. That money came from our joint accounts to fund your affair. Those were legitimate spiritual expenses. Tell that to the judge. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your definition of spiritual expenses. She left without another word, and I knew it would be our last private conversation. Everything else would be handled through lawyers, reduced to legal documents and financial calculations. Our marriage would end the same way it had lived its final months, through intermediaries and careful documentation. Friday brought closure of sorts. The new Faith Ministry building stood empty, with a for lease sign in the window. Malachi's apartment had been cleaned out, leaving behind only unpaid bills and angry creditors. The man who'd spoken directly to God had apparently received divine guidance about the benefits of strategic relocation. I drove past the building on my way home from work, thinking about the Sunday morning when we'd exposed his operation to public scrutiny. It felt like months ago instead of 2 weeks, but the satisfaction remained fresh. We'd identified a problem, gathered evidence, and implemented a solution. Clean, logical, Effective. That evening, the 5 husbands met at the lamplighter for what we'd decided would be our final gathering as a group. We'd accomplished what we'd set out to do, and now it was time to move forward with our individual lives. Channel 12 got 3 more calls from women in other states, David reported. Seems our boy Michael has left quite a trail of spiritual guidance across the Southwest. Any word on criminal charges? Eric asked. Detective Oates thinks they might have enough for fraud charges, but it'll take time to build the case. Meanwhile, Stevens has disappeared completely, probably setting up shop somewhere that doesn't have internet access. We raised our glasses in a final toast to the end of the New Faith ministry and the exposure of its founders' true methodology. 5 men who'd been brought together by betrayal, united by investigation, and bonded by the satisfaction of justice served. Think our wives will ever understand what we did? Caleb asked. Doesn't matter, I replied. We understand what we did. Sometimes that has to be enough. Outside the lamplighter, the city looked exactly the same as it had before Malachi Stern arrived to provide divine guidance to its married women, but appearances could be deceiving. Our community had learned something important about the difference between faith and manipulation, between spiritual leadership and predatory behavior. And 5 husbands had learned that sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't suffering in silence. It's gathering evidence and letting the truth speak for itself. The congregation had risen, all right. They'd risen up against deception, against exploitation, against the man who'd claimed to speak for God while serving only his own appetites. Divine justice, it turned out, sometimes required human intervention, and we'd been happy to provide it. 6 months later, I drove past the building that had once housed the New Faith ministry. The For Lease sign was gone, replaced by a simple wooden cross and a banner reading, Community Fellowship Church, all welcome. I parked and walked to the entrance, curious about what had replaced Malachi's operation. Through the glass doors, I could see families gathering for Sunday morning service, children running between the folding chairs while their parents chatted quietly. The new pastor was a woman in her 50s, dressed simply, speaking with genuine warmth to her congregation. No expensive suits, no BMW in the parking lot, no promises of private consultations or special divine guidance, just honest faith in an honest setting. I didn't go inside. I'd had enough of organized religion for a while. But I stood there for a few minutes, watching people who'd found something real to replace what had been false. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Stevens arrested in Colorado. Same scam, different church. Looks like our media attention finally caught up with him. Justice delayed, but not denied. Michael Stevens would finally face legal consequences for his creative interpretation of spiritual guidance. The documentation we'd provided had helped build a case that followed him across state lines. I drove home to the house that was finally, completely mine. The divorce had been finalized last month, with Margot receiving exactly what she was legally entitled to, minus documented expenses for her spiritual journey. She'd moved to another state, claiming she needed a fresh start away from the judgment of our small community. The other marriages had ended similarly, except for Caleb and Sarah, who'd somehow managed to work through their problems with genuine counseling from a licensed therapist. They were the exception that proved the rule. Real healing required real honesty, not the kind of manufactured forgiveness that ignored actual betrayal. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house where I'd discovered my wife's secret phone conversations and hidden receipts, the same house where I'd compiled evidence and planned our Sunday morning intervention, the same house where I'd learned that sometimes the best response to systematic deception is systematic exposure. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, quiet and peaceful. I had projects to work on, books to read, a life to rebuild on my own terms. No more mysterious phone calls, no more hidden expenses, no more wondering what divine guidance my spouse might be receiving. Just honest solitude in an honest house, which was worth more than any false ministry could ever provide. I got out of the car and walked to my front door, passing the mailbox where Mrs. Greeley had once slipped me photographs that started this whole investigation. She'd moved away last month, claiming the neighborhood had gotten too exciting for her taste. Inside, I poured myself a glass of good whiskey. Not the cheap stuff I'd been drinking during the worst of the marriage troubles, but something worth savoring. I raised the glass in a private toast to absent friends and exposed frauds, to evidence gathered and justice served. Guess I finally found my faith, I said to the empty room. Faith in documentation, investigation, and the power of truth to set people free. Outside, church bells were ringing across the city, calling people to various forms of worship and spiritual guidance. Some of it would be genuine, some of it would be false, and some of it would fall somewhere in between. But in my house, at least, there were no more secrets, no more lies, no more divine guidance that required hotel rooms and expensive lingerie. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of a job well done. The congregation had risen, all right, and some of us were still standing.